The American Revolution, why it started and how it ended. The world before the Revolution. A quiet night before a very loud century. Imagine this. It's late. Too late. The kind of hour where the world feels like it's holding its breath, and the air sits heavy in your room, as if history itself is leaning in to whisper something you didn't ask for. Outside, the wind moves slowly, brushing past the window like an old friend trying not to wake anyone. And somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, the sort of bark that sounds like even it is tired of being awake. This is where our story begins. Not with fireworks, not with dramatic speeches, and definitely not with the founding fathers signing things as if they were influencers getting brand deals. No. The American Revolution starts in the quiet, in tiny irritations, in paper laws, in clumsy imperial memos written by men who had no idea how to handle a colony that had suddenly grown too big for its boots. It begins with a question, whispered in taverns, argued in dusty meeting halls, and muttered by farmers leaning on fence posts. Why are we being ruled by people who have never even seen the place we live? It starts slowly, like a kettle warming, and as always, nobody expects that it will eventually boil over. The world before the Revolution, a forest, a continent, and a very confused empire. To understand why the American Revolution happened, we need to go back. Not just a few years, but decades, maybe even a century. Because revolutions don't appear out of nowhere like unwanted pop-up ads. They grow, layer by layer, until everyone involved just collectively decides, yeah, this is getting ridiculous. And so we travel to North America in the mid-1700s. The continent is enormous, wild, and astonishingly noisy. Birds scream from treetops with the energy of creatures who have never known rent. Rivers crash through forests in long, winding corridors, dragging entire trees along for the ride. And the air smells of pine, earth, and a future nobody has written yet. In the midst of this vastness, 13 British colonies cling to the Atlantic coastline like overly attached barnacles. They're filled with people who work far too hard, argue far too loudly, and believe far too deeply that they deserve something better, though they're not quite sure what that something is yet. Meanwhile, across the ocean in London, the British Empire sits like an exhausted babysitter trying to keep track of too many misbehaving children. And to be fair, the empire had been through a lot. Wars, debt, more wars, more debt, and then, just for fun, another war on a continent with trees taller than its tallest ships. That war, the 7 Years' War, or as the colonists called it, the French and Indian War, had changed everything. The aftermath of the war, empire with a receipt. By 1763, Britain had won the war but lost its wallet. The empire was in debt so deep that it made modern student loans look like pocket change. Nearly every British politician stared at the numbers and came to the exact same conclusion. Let's make the colonies pay for this. What could possibly go wrong? And the colonists, who'd just fought alongside British soldiers in muddy forests, freezing winters, and mosquito-infested summers, responded with the 18th century equivalent of, wait, what? You see, the colonists had developed a charming little habit during the war. They had begun to think of themselves as equal partners to Britain. Britain, on the other hand, had developed a charming little habit of its own. It still saw the colonists as rebellious teenagers who needed constant supervision. Both perspectives were understandable, and both perspectives were destined to collide with the grace of two carriages trying to fit into the same narrow London street. The colonial mindset, growing confidence, growing distance. If you walked through a colonial town in the 1760s, Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, you'd feel a strange kind of energy, a restless, buzzing atmosphere, like the entire place was waiting for someone to announce the next big thing. People here were used to solving problems themselves, building homes, planting fields, making laws, negotiating with native nations, surviving winters that would have made most European cities politely pass away. And being thousands of miles from London had created a feeling, not independence yet, but something close. A sense that maybe the colonies weren't just branches of a tree, maybe they were growing roots of their own. And then Britain stepped in and essentially said, "Good news, we've decided to manage you more closely now." Because of course they did. The first sparks, laws that nobody asked for. The first real clash didn't involve a battlefield or even a protest. It involved paperwork, which honestly is the most British way a revolution could possibly begin. London rolled out a list of new taxes and acts. The Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Stamp Act, each one designed to bring in money, each one passed by a parliament where not a single American had a seat. To Britain, this was normal, rational, obviously necessary. To the colonists, it felt like being charged rent by a landlord who lived across the ocean and didn't know their name. And then, like a spark landing on dry leaves, a simple, powerful phrase began to appear everywhere. No taxation without representation. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a warning. A quiet, growing realization that something fundamental had shifted. The kettle was heating up, steam was building, and no one, not even the people living through it, knew just how hot things were about to get. Transition, the calm before the riots. And so the stage was set. An empire struggling with money, a continent full of frustrated colonists, a parliament passing laws as if the Atlantic Ocean didn't exist, and a political relationship held together with duct tape, wishful thinking, and a few outdated assumptions. What came next would be louder, messier, and far more dramatic than anyone expected. But before the tea gets dumped, before the guns fire at Lexington, before a group of men gather in Philadelphia to commit what the British would politely call treason, we need to step even deeper into the world that shaped all of this. So, take a breath, let the night settle around you, and follow the story a little further into the heart of a revolution that was, at its core, a slow-burning argument that finally found its voice.
The Stamp Act, the anger, and the slow unraveling of an empire. Night deepens over the colonies. Candles flicker behind wooden-paned windows. Taverns hum with low voices. And in the uneasy glow of firelight, something new begins to spread. Not quite rage, not quite rebellion, but irritation. And irritation, as every historian knows, is the first true indicator that someone is about to do something dramatic. Because history rarely starts with fury, it starts with a sigh. And in 1765, millions of colonists let out the same collective sigh when Parliament introduced the most infamous piece of paperwork in American history, the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act, a tiny piece of paper with a massive attitude. If you've ever had to pay an extra fee for something that already felt outrageously overpriced, then congratulations, you understand exactly how the colonists felt. The Stamp Act was simple. Every legal document, newspaper, pamphlet, deck of playing cards, yes, even those, had to carry an official British stamp. The stamp cost money. Money went to Britain. Britain used it to pay off its war debt. The colonists used it to develop a deep and fiery resentment. When word of the law reached the colonies, it spread slowly across taverns and church steps, carried by travelers on dirt roads and merchants shouting the news at crowded docks. And as the information traveled, it grew thorns. People stared at the law, then at their wallets, then at their distant British rulers, and realized, we have absolutely no say in this. This realization did not sit quietly in the corner. It got loud, and then it got louder. The first protests. Taverns became battlefields of opinion. On warm evenings in Boston, the Sons of Liberty, a group so dramatic they could have been a theater troupe, gathered in bars, basements, and back rooms to express their disgust with the laws that Parliament seemed to invent at random. Men slammed tankards onto wooden tables, beer sloshing over the edges as they ranted about liberty and tyranny, and the absurdity of paying a tax on playing cards. Because if there's one way to make a population angry, it's by interfering with their entertainment. In Charleston, Philadelphia, and New York, crowds gathered in marketplaces, shouting and waving homemade banners, their voices echoing off stone walls and wooden storefronts. The words "no taxation without representation" appeared on posters, pamphlets, buttons, and probably at least one very confused goat. It was more than a slogan. It was a declaration of emotional boundaries. Britain responded and made things much, much worse. When the protests reached London, Parliament reacted with the calm rationality of someone who has spilled tea on an official document. They panicked and then insisted everything was fine. "We have full authority over the colonies," they said. "We can tax them whenever we want," they insisted. "And they should be grateful," they added, proving they had absolutely no idea what was happening in America. The British government reduced the Stamp Act a year later, which almost helped, before immediately passing another law called the Declaratory Act, which basically said, "By the way, we still control you completely, just so we're clear." This was like apologizing to someone and then slapping them with a second apology. The colonies took note. The Townshend Acts, because of course there were more taxes. After the Stamp Act fiasco, you'd think London would stop poking the angry bear, but no, they found a bigger stick. In 1767, Parliament introduced the Townshend Acts, placing taxes on tea, glass, paint, and other essentials. To the colonists, this wasn't just taxation. This was Parliament saying, "We can still do whatever we want." And the colonies, already annoyed, now became furious. Boycotts began. Merchants refused to import British goods. Women, who played a far bigger role in the revolution than textbooks often admit, gathered in sewing circles to produce homespun cloth, quietly transforming domestic labor into political resistance. In quiet kitchens, lit by soft candlelight, women worked thread through cloth, talking about Parliament, liberty, and what kind of world they wanted their children to grow up in. This was not rebellion, not yet, but it was the shadow of one, the earliest outline. Tension in Boston, a city boiling from the inside. If there was one place where the revolution lived, breathed, and occasionally yelled from rooftops, it was Boston. Boston was a city of tight streets, uneasy politics, and a population that treated arguments like a local sport. It was also home to some of the most opinionated people in North America, which made it the perfect place for things to go horribly wrong. By 1768, tensions were rising like steam from a boiling pot. Redcoats paraded through the streets with polished boots and shining muskets. Bostonians glared from windows with crossed arms and clenched jaws. Every day, the two sides bumped into each other, in markets, in alleys, in taverns, and every day the irritation grew. Boston felt like a storm cloud, thick, heavy, crackling with electricity. Everyone waited for the lightning to strike. The march towards the massacre. Fog, footsteps, and rising anger. On a cold March evening, Boston's streets were coated in a thin frost. Lanterns flickered in the wind, casting stretching shadows along the cobblestone roads. A lone British sentry stood guard outside the customs house, stamping his feet against the freezing air, while a few locals muttered insults at him from across the street. It started with snowballs, small ones, then larger ones with rocks hidden inside, then shouts, then a crowd. British reinforcements arrived, muskets gleaming under the lantern light. The crowd thickened, voices rising like the roar of waves crashing against cliffs. And then, in a moment that would echo across history, a gun fired. Maybe it was an accident, maybe it wasn't. The truth hovered in the winter air, lost in the chaos. More shots followed, screams, smoke, silence. When the air finally cleared, 5 colonists lay dying on the cold street. Boston froze, the empire trembled, and a massacre, small by military standards, enormous by political ones, lit a fuse that could no longer be extinguished. The aftermath: ink, anger, and a city that would not forget. News of the event spread faster than any British official could contain it. In taverns, people whispered the names of the dead. In churches, ministers preached about tyranny. And in print shops, men like Paul Revere engraved scenes of the massacre that captured exactly the kind of emotional charge the moment required. Subtlety was not the goal. Posters appeared across the colonies, depicting the incident as proof of British brutality, and suddenly people who had never cared about taxes were asking questions about liberty. Britain withdrew most of the taxes soon after, a quiet attempt to calm things down. But history doesn't reverse, it only moves forward. And the colonies had crossed a line. Their anger was no longer scattered, it was focused. Something irreversible had begun. Transition, the road to the Tea Party. And so, the 1770s opened like a dimly lit hallway filled with uncertainty. On one side, Britain, frustrated, confused, and increasingly authoritarian. On the other, 13 colonies, restless, resentful, and beginning to recognize their own power. What happened next would involve tea, far too much tea, and an event so dramatic that it would make every future protest look like it needed to try harder. But for now, the wind continues to blow over Boston Harbor, the moon hangs low, and the revolution, still in its earliest whispers, prepares to find its voice.
The tea, the provocation, and the point of no return. The night hangs heavy over Boston Harbor. The water is dark and still, like a sheet of polished obsidian stretching out beneath the moon. Ships sit anchored in silence, their masts rising like thin skeletons against the sky. The city sleeps uneasily. Even the wind seems to tiptoe. And somewhere beneath this quiet surface, tension coils tighter and tighter, like a rope pulled by 2 hands that refuse to let go. Because by 1773, things had reached a strange place. Not war, not peace. More like a bad relationship where both sides keep sending mixed signals and neither is willing to admit that it's actually over. Britain still believed the colonies were loyal children. The colonies were beginning to suspect that Britain was a parent who had stopped listening long ago. And tea, yes, tea, was about to become the spark that set everything ablaze. The Tea Act, a cup of chaos. The Tea Act of 1773 was supposed to be harmless, helpful even. It was meant to save the struggling British East India Company by giving it a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, effectively letting it ship tea directly to American ports at a cheaper price. Cheaper tea, stabler company, everyone happy, right? Well, no, because the colonists saw exactly what Britain was doing. To them, the Tea Act wasn't generosity, it was a trap. A clever way to make Americans accept a tax they had been resisting for years. Or in modern terms, oh look, they're lowering the price so we won't complain about the fine print. The colonists were not amused. Taverns erupted with debate, newspapers published fiery essays, dockworkers murmured angrily while heaving crates across the waterfront. And in Boston, the world capital of political dramatics, things escalated quickly. Boston's anger, loud, proud, and ready to throw things. The tea ships arrived quietly, their hulls heavy with chests of leaves that smelled faintly of the Empire's arrogance. But the docks were not quiet. Crowds gathered the moment the ships anchored. Merchants folded their arms, Sons of Liberty sharpened their rhetoric, and men like Samuel Adams, who had the political subtlety of a fireworks display, declared that the tea would not be unloaded. Not now, not ever. The British loyalist governor, Thomas Hutchinson, insisted the ships stay until the tea was paid for and distributed, which led the whole colony into the world's worst standoff. The ships couldn't leave without unloading. The colonists refused to unload them. Hutchinson refused to let them sail away. Everyone glared at everyone else for days. Boston Harbor became a floating prison of tea and tension, and something had to give. The Boston Tea Party. Saltwater, moonlight, and a very bad night for tea. On the cold night of December 16, 1773, the air over Boston tasted like winter and anticipation. In the Old South Meeting House, thousands of colonists packed tightly together, their breath clouding in the chill, their voices rising in anxious waves. Samuel Adams stood before them, delivering one more rousing speech, the kind that made you want to take action even if you weren't exactly sure what the action would be. Then, at the perfect climactic moment, he declared, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country," which, as every Bostonian understood, was not a statement, it was a signal. Outside, men disguised themselves, not well, mind you, as Mohawk warriors. Their outfits looked more like last-minute theater costumes than actual cultural attire, but the point wasn't authenticity. The point was anonymity. Dozens moved silently through the lantern-lit streets, boots on cobblestones, voices hushed, the wind whipping through their makeshift feathers. When they reached the ships, the men climbed aboard and began their strangely methodical rebellion. They didn't hurt the sailors. They didn't steal anything. They just walked to the cargo holds, cracked open the 342 chests of tea, and dumped the contents into the icy harbor. For hours, the water swirled with dark leaves, a vast brew mixing into the Atlantic, transforming the harbor into the world's largest, angriest cup of tea. On shore, citizens watched in silence, some with awe, some with fear, all knowing that they had just crossed a line from which there was no return. Boston smelled of salt, night air, and political consequences. Britain reacts by dropping an anvil from a great height. When word of the Tea Party reached London, Parliament did not laugh, shrug, or send a polite letter asking everyone to calm down. No, they unleashed the Coercive Acts, which the colonists quickly renamed the Intolerable Acts because if anyone understood branding, it was 18th century Americans. These laws were harsh. The Boston Port Act closed the harbor until the tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Government Act gutted local self-rule. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British trials to be held in England, far from local juries. And new quartering requirements meant colonists had to house British soldiers. Boston felt suffocated, its economy strangled, its rights stripped away, its future overshadowed by British boots marching through its narrow streets. But something else happened, something Britain did not expect. The colonies rallied. Food, supplies, and money poured into Boston from across North America. Carolinians sent rice, Pennsylvanians sent flour. Communities held prayer meetings and public gatherings, declaring that Boston's suffering was the suffering of all. It was the first real moment the colonies behaved not as 13 separate children, but as a family. A dysfunctional one, sure, but a family. The First Continental Congress, a gathering of the reluctant revolutionaries. In September 1774, representatives from 12 colonies, Georgia was fashionably absent, met in Philadelphia. Imagine the scene. Horse hooves clattering on cobblestone streets, delegates stepping off carriages with travel dust clinging to their coats, the smell of ink, parchment, and pipe tobacco drifting through the meeting hall, men murmuring about British tyranny while sipping bitter colonial coffee. Some delegates, like Patrick Henry, arrived itching for dramatic statements. Others, like John Dickinson, still clung to hope for reconciliation. And most, in truth, had no idea what they were about to unleash. They drafted a declaration of colonial rights, agreed to boycott British goods, and promised to reconvene if Britain didn't change course. Then they went home uncertain, uneasy, but unified. It wasn't independence, not yet, but the winds were shifting. The horizon was darkening, the storm approaching. The final quiet before the storm, 1775. Winter settled over the colonies like a warning. British troops in Boston grew restless, wandering narrow streets under the watchful glares of angry locals. Colonial militias trained quietly in fields at dawn, muskets slung over shoulders, breath misting in the cold air. Something was coming. Everyone could feel it. Like the pause between lightning and thunder, like the inhale before the shout, like the last peaceful moment before a world changes forever. Britain prepared to enforce its rule, the colonists prepared to resist it, and both sides moved closer and closer to a spark that within months would ignite a war neither truly believed would happen, until it did.
Lexington, Concord, and the moment the world tipped into war. Dawn comes slowly in April, especially in New England, where spring likes to take its time, stretching itself awake like a sleepy cat, testing the air with thin rays of sunlight before deciding whether it actually wants to commit to warmth today. On the morning of April 19th, 1775, the sky over Massachusetts is pale and uncertain, the kind of bluish gray that feels like it hasn't quite made up its mind. A soft mist drifts over the countryside, settling into the folds of fields, curling between stone walls, and brushing gently against the wooden homes of towns still half asleep. But inside those homes, people aren't sleeping. Not tonight, not after what Paul Revere started. The midnight ride, lanterns, hoofbeats, and an empire about to be surprised. The evening before, Boston buzzed with a nervous electricity. British regulars were on the move, quiet, disciplined, trying desperately not to look suspicious as they prepared to march out of the city. Their goal was simple, at least on paper: head to Concord, seize colonial weapons, arrest a few prominent troublemakers, and then presumably return to Boston for tea and self-congratulations. But the colonists had built something the British didn't fully understand: a communication network made up of taverns, church steeples, lantern codes, and people who were exceptionally nosy. So when two lanterns briefly glowed from the steeple of Old North Church, the famous 1 if by land, 2 if by sea signal, men were already saddling their horses. Paul Revere rode out like a man late for an appointment with destiny, galloping through the night and shouting warnings. Other riders fanned out across the countryside. Dogs barked, doors flew open, lanterns flickered on in small houses scattered along winding dirt roads, and the message spread like fire across dry grass: the regulars are coming. Not the British, because technically everyone was still British. Not the enemy, because most people still hoped there wouldn't be one. Just the regulars, a neutral term for a rapidly worsening situation. Lexington, the first shots, the first fear, the first realization. As dawn stretched over the horizon, a small band of colonial militia, the Lexington Minutemen, gathered on the town green. They were farmers, blacksmiths, fathers, sons, dressed in clothes meant for work, not war. Their muskets were old, mismatched, and not exactly intimidating. Still, they stood there, not to start a war, but to show they wouldn't run from one. Then, through the morning haze, came the unmistakable glint of polished steel. Dozens of British soldiers appeared on the road, marching in tight formation, red coats bright even in the dim light. They looked sharp, confident, regimented, men trained to move as one seamless unit. They halted. The colonists held their ground, and for a moment, an impossibly long, echoing moment, no one moved. Then a single shot cracked through the air. One shot. No one knew who fired it, but history just reacts. The British line flinched. Muskets lifted. More shots rang out. chaotic, confused. When the smoke drifted away, 8 colonists lay still on the grass. The militia scattered, the British marched on, and the war, whether anyone wanted it or not, had begun. Concord, a bridge, a river, and the sound of a revolution finding its voice. While Lexington froze in shock, Concord was already bracing itself. Militia companies from surrounding towns had gathered, hundreds of men waiting on hills, fields, and roads. They watched the British search the town, overturning barrels, breaking open crates, looking for weapons that had been hidden hours earlier. The standoff moved to the North Bridge, a wooden span arching peacefully over the slow-moving river. Mist drifted along the water like a ghostly shroud as colonial forces approached from one side, British troops holding the other. Once again, 2 lines stared across a narrowing distance. Once again, tension thickened the air. But this time, when a shot cracked out, the militia didn't run. They fired back. Volleys shook the bridge. Smoke curled upward in gray spirals. Soldiers stumbled backward, startled by a resistance that was no longer symbolic. The British forces retreated, falling back towards Boston, and the march quickly turned from an orderly withdrawal into something more like a nightmare. The retreat, miles of gunfire, and a country waking up. As the British marched down the long, narrow road towards Boston, colonial militias struck from every tree line, stone wall, and ridge. Farmers fired from behind barns, blacksmiths shot from hedgerows, old men who could barely lift muskets still took aim from their porches. Every mile was an ambush. Every bend in the road brought another volley. The British, trained for open field warfare, found themselves trapped in a landscape that fought them at every turn. Muskets boomed, branches snapped, voices shouted from invisible positions. The red-coated regulars quickened their pace, exhaustion and panic mixing as they pushed onward. By the time they staggered into Boston, their ranks shattered, their uniforms torn, and their nerves frayed. One thing had become absolutely clear. The colonies weren't bluffing. They weren't posturing. They weren't protesting. They were fighting, and the Empire had a full-fledged rebellion on its hands. The Siege of Boston, a city in a stalemate. Within days, thousands of colonial militia surrounded Boston, cutting it off from the mainland like a trapped animal in a cage. Inside the city, British troops prepared for the long haul. Supplies ran low, tensions ran high, and Boston became the cramped, uneasy heart of a war that neither side fully understood yet. Outside the city, militia camps stretched across the hills. At night, campfires flickered like scattered stars across the dark countryside. Men whispered, argued, prayed. Some were afraid, some were excited. All were aware that the world as they knew it had shifted. Quietly, almost humbly, a suggestion began to spread. We need leadership. We need unity. We need something bigger. And so, far from the gunpowder and smoke of Boston, delegates began traveling once more to Philadelphia, because it was time for the next chapter, time for decisions no one could take back, time for a revolution to get organized. Transition. A continent decides its future. The year is 1775, and everything hangs suspended in an uncertain balance. British ships wait in Boston Harbor, their sails furled tight. Colonial militias ring the city like patient, quietly furious sentinels. And across the land, farmers, merchants, ministers, and laborers all whisper the same question: what happens now? Soon, representatives will gather in a hot, crowded room in Philadelphia. Soon, a tall Virginian named George Washington will step forward. Soon, the world will tilt again, heavier this time, louder, irreversible. But for a moment, this brief, trembling moment, the colonies stand at the edge of a future they have not yet dared to imagine. War has arrived. The revolution is no longer a possibility. It is a reality. And now they must choose what kind of world they want to build from the ashes. When you're ready for the next chapter, the choosing of Washington, the Battle of Bunker Hill, the formation of the Continental Army, just say,
Washington, Bunker Hill, and the moment the Revolution grew teeth. Philadelphia in the summer of 1775 is hot in that particular colonial way, a mixture of humidity, horse smells, and the faint aroma of political anxiety. Carriages rattle over cobblestones, delegates fan themselves with folded papers, streets hum with gossip and rumors that feel heavier with each passing day. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, the Second Continental Congress has reconvened. Men wipe sweat from their brows, argue in clipped whispers, pace back and forth across wooden floors worn thin by years of footsteps and indecision. They have a war, whether they like it or not, and now they need to decide what to do with it. The Congress, uncertain men in a very certain crisis. The delegates aren't revolutionaries, not really. They're lawyers, farmers, merchants, scholars, men who would very much like to fix this mess without taking on the world's most powerful empire. But Lexington and Concord have thrown subtlety out the window. The siege of Boston is underway, and thousands of armed colonists are now camping in ragged lines around the city like an uninvited storm cloud. Someone needs to lead these men. Someone who isn't a local hothead or a militia captain with enthusiasm but zero strategic experience. Someone who looks the part. Someone tall, someone calm, someone who can make the entire room exhale just by standing there. Enter George Washington. Washington, the man who looked like a commander before he was one. Washington arrives in Congress wearing his old military uniform, a bold fashion choice and shockingly effective. There he stands, tall, quiet, composed, wearing blue and buff, with the air of a man who could either lead an army or politely decline dessert depending on what the situation requires. John Adams, who has the subtlety of a cannon blast, nominates him almost immediately. Washington, mortified, tries to look modest. He even steps outside during the vote, which only makes everyone like him more. And so, in a moment that feels both inevitable and improvised, George Washington becomes Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He accepts with humility. He promises no salary. He warns that he is not equal to the task, which, historically speaking, is the exact way people behave right before they become icons. The Battle of Bunker Hill, smoke, fire, and a lesson in brutal reality. While Congress debates and assigns titles, Boston is preparing for something much more immediate. The British, trapped inside the city, see the colonial fortifications rising on the hills across the river. Dirt mounds, wooden stakes, ragged men working through the night. On June 17, 1775, the British Army decides to do something very British. They will march uphill, in tight formation, in bright red coats, directly at entrenched colonial forces firing down on them. What could possibly go wrong? The colonists watch from Breed's Hill, not actually Bunker Hill, but history loves the wrong name, clutching their muskets, their nerves stretched thin. Their commander, Colonel Prescott, gives a command that will echo through centuries. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Not because it sounded dramatic, but because they barely had enough gunpowder to make this battle last more than a few minutes. The British advance, step by step, row by row, bayonets gleaming, drums pounding, smoke drifting across the harbor like a veiled warning. When they get close enough, terrifyingly close, the colonists open fire. The British line nearly collapses. They retreat, regroup, advance again, take even more casualties, retreat again. By the time they take the hill on the third assault, the colonists have run out of ammunition. They fall back, slowly, stubbornly, still fighting with whatever they have left. Technically, the British win the battle. Realistically, though, they lose. Hundreds of their soldiers lie on the hillside. Officers fall in shocking numbers. The cost is so high that General Clinton later remarks, "A few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America." The colonists may have abandoned the hill, but they gain something far more important, the knowledge that they can stand toe-to-toe with the Empire. And Britain learns something too. This rebellion is not going to politely go away. Washington arrives and finds an army held together by hope and twine. On a warm July day, Washington reaches Boston and surveys the Continental Army. For the first time. It is a sight. Militiamen wander freely. Some lack shoes, some lack discipline, some lack any concept of military structure whatsoever. Tents sag, supplies are short, gunpowder dangerously low, but spirits? High, almost absurdly high. Washington, with the patience of a saint and the posture of a man staring down a very long to-do list, begins to shape this chaos into something resembling an army. He imposes discipline, creates organization, coordinates supplies, and somehow, miraculously, earns the respect of men who are unused to taking orders from anyone. The British, watching from Boston, see the camps expanding. They see fortifications rising, and they begin to realize that the man in blue and buff is not a symbolic leader. He is a threat. The Olive Branch Petition, the last polite knock on a locked door. Meanwhile, Congress sends a final plea to King George III. The Olive Branch Petition is warm, respectful, and entirely doomed. It asks for reconciliation and understanding. The king, upon receiving it, says something equivalent to, "Absolutely not." He declares the colonies in open rebellion. He refuses to read the petition. He doubles down on military suppression. And just like that, any hope of a gentle diplomatic ending evaporates. The bridge back to peace burns, the road forward narrows, and the colonies inch closer to a decision they have feared for years. The push toward independence, a realization growing in the dark. During the winter of 1775 to 1776, as Boston freezes over and Washington fortifies his positions on the surrounding hills, a shift begins quietly spreading through the colonies. People start whispering a word still considered dangerous, a word that tastes foreign in the mouth, a word that feels like both a promise and a threat. Independence. It begins in pamphlets, in taverns, in farmhouses lit with dim firelight, in discussions long after midnight among men who never expected to become soldiers. The idea grows, slowly at first, then loudly, and soon someone will arrive to give this idea a voice, a loud, passionate, unforgettable voice that will echo across the world. Thomas Paine. But that's for the next chapter, because right now, the siege of Boston is tightening, supplies are dwindling, British commanders are growing nervous, and Washington, tall, quiet, determined, stands overlooking the city, waiting for the moment when the war will shift in his favor for the very first time. The revolution is no longer a series of skirmishes. It is now a military conflict headed towards something larger, deeper, and impossible to undo. The world is changing, and the colonies, for the first time, are beginning to imagine themselves as something they have never been before: a nation. When you're ready for the moment Paine shakes the world, Washington takes Boston, and the colonies move toward declaring independence, just say,
The Long Night of War, 1778 through 1780. And so the American Revolution drifted into its next act, one of those slow, heavy chapters where everyone is exhausted, nobody really knows what they're doing anymore, and half the armies are wondering why they ever signed up in the first place. Think of it like season 4 of a show that was only meant to run for 2. The stakes are still high, the tension is still there, but everyone is just tired.
It is now 1778, and winter has finally unclenched its icy jaw from the throats of the men at Valley Forge. Washington's army, once starved and half frozen, emerges looking more like, well, an actual army. Thanks to Baron von Steuben, the ex-Prussian soldier with a questionable resume but impeccable timing, American troops learned how to march, fire, reload, and not immediately trip over each other when someone yelled, "Form a line!" A miracle, honestly. The Continentals walk out of the forests of Valley Forge taller, straighter, and slightly less likely to accidentally shoot their own boots, and as they do, a quiet ripple passes across the Atlantic. Something is changing, something big. France, yes, that France, the eternal rival of Britain, the homeland of wine, powdered wigs, and polite backstabbing, officially joins the war on the side of the Americans. And when I say join, I don't mean they sent good vibes and a box of macarons. No, they sent fleets, they sent money, they sent professional soldiers who actually knew what they were doing. For the first time, Britain realizes this isn't just an annoying colonial uprising, it is now a global conflict, and they might actually lose. Imagine being a British general when the news arrives. You remember that tiny problem in the colonies? Yes? Well, France heard you were struggling and decided to make it worse. Of course they did. The British respond the only way an empire with too much pride and not enough perspective can respond. They pivot, they shift strategies. If the North is becoming a meat grinder, then surely the South will be easier. The population there is supposedly more loyal to the crown, more agreeable, more civil. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Obviously everything. But for now, the British believe they found a clever new angle. They land in Savannah, they move into Georgia, and for a moment, a brief shimmering moment, it actually works. British flags fly over southern cities, loyalists emerge from the woodlands with a sort of "we liked you guys the whole time" energy. And London, thousands of miles away, convinces itself that the war is nearly won. But war, as always, is not about strategy on paper. It's about people. It's about emotion. It's about messy realities. And the messy reality of the American South is that loyalties are complicated. Neighbors hate neighbors, families split, someone's cousin insults someone's cattle, and suddenly entire counties are burning. What begins as a British strategy turns into a civil war inside a larger war, a tangled, violent knot of revenge, retribution, and really bad decisions. Up north, meanwhile, Washington is, well, Washington. Calm, stoic, a man trying to win a war with an army that evaporates every winter and half the time doesn't have shoes. But now he's got something else. Hope. And hope, when mixed with French warships, becomes a very powerful thing. The war drifts into 1779, a year that is remembered mostly for frustration. British forces raid coastal towns. American militia retaliate in unpredictable, annoying ways. The French fleet tries to coordinate with Washington, and as usual, weather ruins everything. It rains whenever coordination might have helped, and it remains beautifully sunny anytime disaster is inevitable. Classic 18th century meteorology. Still, something is shifting beneath the surface. Whispers ripple through taverns, farmhouses, and army camps. The British are wearing down, their supplies are thinning, their troops are tiring. A giant empire is bleeding slowly from 1,000 tiny wounds. And in the middle of that slow bleed stands Washington, not brilliant in every battle, not victorious in every campaign, but unbroken, unmoved, unyielding, the kind of leader who stands in the center of a storm and somehow convinces everyone that the storm is temporary. By 1780, the war reaches one of its darkest moments, and ironically, darkness often comes right before the glow of victory, though nobody knows that yet. In 1780, all they know is suffering. The British take Charleston after a massive siege. It is one of the worst American defeats of the entire war. Thousands of Continental soldiers are captured. The British believe their southern strategy is finally working. And honestly, it kind of is, for the moment. But history has a sense of humor, and its favorite punchline in 1780 is that even in defeat, the seeds of victory are quietly being planted. Because as Charleston falls, something else rises, a new kind of resistance. Swamp-riding patriots led by Francis Marion, the so-called Swamp Fox, begin turning the South into a mosquito-infested nightmare for British patrols. Guerrilla warfare explodes. British officers begin writing letters home like, "Dear Mother, the colonials will not fight us properly. They keep running away. They keep hiding in swamps. This is terribly rude." And somewhere in the background, the Swamp Fox is probably laughing. The South transforms into a chessboard of chaos, sneak attacks, ambushes, night raids, burned supplies, and arguments over who stole whose horse. The British soon realize that controlling cities does not mean controlling the countryside, or the people, or the narrative. And as the British struggle, another storm brews, this time silently, invisibly, inside the heart of the Continental Army. Supplies are gone, pay is non-existent, morale collapses, men desert, officers resign. Even Washington fears the entire rebellion is one bad month away from evaporating. But revolutions are strange creatures. They often survive not because they are strong, but because they refuse to die. And in the ashes of 1780, the Americans refuse, stubbornly, irrationally, beautifully, to die. The French ships are coming, the British are stretching themselves too thin, and somewhere on the horizon, though nobody realizes it yet, the end of the war is beginning to take shape. But for now, welcome to the darkest hour before dawn.
The last dawn, Yorktown, peace, and the quiet echo of a new nation. And now, at last, we drift into the final stretch of this long, stubborn, unpredictable war. The late 1780s arrive like the slow brightening of a sky that's been dark for so long you'd almost forgotten what morning looks like. It is 1781, and the world feels different. Not because the war is over, but because the shape of its ending has begun to sharpen. France is all in now. Washington has regained his balance. The Continental Army, though still hungry, ragged, and unpaid, is experienced, hardened, and strangely hopeful. Even the British, powerful, prideful, endlessly formal, are beginning to feel the pull of exhaustion. And as if fate were writing its own screenplay, one British general steps forward as the perfect antagonist for the war's final act, Lord Charles Cornwallis, a man who is brilliant in some ways, stubborn in others, and destined, though he doesn't know it, to become the unwilling star of every American classroom poster about surrender at Yorktown. But let's not rush. The war doesn't end with a single trumpet blast. It ends the way real things end, slowly, messily, unevenly. Cornwallis campaigns across the South, trying to force the rebellion into submission, and he wins battles, plenty of them, but every victory is hollow. Every field he captures costs him men he can't replace. Every loyalist he tries to protect is attacked the moment he turns his back. He is winning battles and losing the war, one frustrating march at a time. Then comes Yorktown, a quiet town in Virginia, peaceful, ordinary. Cornwallis enters it expecting rest, resupply, and maybe a moment of sanity. What he doesn't expect is that this will be the place where the entire British campaign collapses like a poorly built stage set. Washington hears Cornwallis is in Yorktown, and something ancient flickers inside him, a rare spark of opportunity. For 6 long years, he's chased the British across forests, frozen valleys, burning fields, and muddy coastlines. For 6 long years, he's tasted defeat and endurance far more often than victory. But Yorktown feels different, achievable, possible. And so begins one of the most beautifully synchronized moments of the entire revolution. Washington and the French general Rochambeau march their armies south with a quiet, patient determination. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sails north, slipping past the British Navy with what can only be described as miraculous timing, or extremely inconvenient weather, depending on whom you ask. And together they form a circle, an elegant trap around Yorktown.
Cornwallis looks out from his earthworks and realizes slowly, painfully, that he is surrounded by an army on land and a fleet at sea. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, nowhere to go except exactly where his enemies want him. The siege begins. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The deep boom of cannons echoing over the river, the whistle of shells gliding through the autumn air, the steady thud of engineers digging trenches by moonlight, the low murmur of soldiers staring into the darkness, knowing something enormous is unfolding. The American and French lines inch closer, night by night, trench by trench. Yorktown shrinks under the weight of the inevitable. Cornwallis writes desperate letters to the British High Command, pleading for rescue, but the rescue never comes. The Navy is too far, the Army is too scattered, the Empire is too tired. On October 19th, 1781, there is nothing left for him to do. Cornwallis surrenders. His troops march out with lowered colors, muffled drums, and the heavy shame of a war lost not just to enemies, but to distance, miscalculation, and a rebellion that simply refused to die. And just like that, the war, though not officially ended, feels spiritually over. Britain still has armies on the continent, Washington still has hungry men camped in open fields, diplomats still squabble in dimly lit European chambers, but Yorktown is the breaking point. The British public loses appetite, Parliament loses patience, even the king recognizes the futility of throwing more lives into a conflict slowly dissolving in their hands. In 1783, peace finally arrives. The Treaty of Paris is signed with all the ceremony and awkwardness of a breakup that everyone saw coming years earlier. Britain acknowledges the independence of the United States. Borders are drawn, fishing rights are argued over, because of course they are, and the war officially, quietly ends. But the story doesn't fade with the ink on a treaty. Instead, it dissolves into something softer, more human. The American soldiers go home, or at least to whatever homes still exist after years of war. Some find their families waiting, others return to empty land, ruined farms, or dreams they barely remember. Many never received the pay they were promised. Some carry the war with them for the rest of their lives, in their memories, in their wounds, in the way they flinch at thunder. And Washington, the man who held the army together with sheer force of will, does something truly astonishing. He resigns. He steps away from power, walks back into private life, and proves, with quiet dignity, that revolutions don't just need victories. They need restraint. They need example. They need someone willing to show that freedom isn't built by conquering, but by letting go. And the new nation, young and fragile and endlessly contradictory, takes its first unsteady steps into existence. No fireworks yet, no grand celebrations, just a sense of something new, something uncertain, something quietly hopeful rising over the horizon. The American Revolution ends the way many great stories end, not with thunder, but with sunrise, with questions instead of answers, with a country still learning how to be a country. A world has changed, a people have changed, and history, as always, marches on. So, as we close our eyes and let this story drift into the late night quiet, remember this. Revolutions aren't born from perfection. They're born from persistence, from flawed people with stubborn dreams, from nights that feel endless and mornings that come later than they should. And in that long, sleepless journey, a new nation emerged, against odds, against empires, against the very gravity of history itself. The fire of resistance has dimmed now. The fields are quiet. The cannons are silent, and the war, at last, is over.